Buenas tardes a todos, mi nombre es Catalina Mena, soy periodista y ensayista de artes visuales y quiero darles la bienvenida a esta sesión de Puerto de Ideas, que es una instancia para pensar el ahora e imaginar el futuro. La actividad de hoy es presentada en conjunto con Escondida y VHP y tenemos como invitada a Judith Butler, lo cual es un honor para mí. Judith Butler es una filósofa estadounidense y profesora de la Universidad de Berkeley, California. Desde hace más de 30 años viene realizando importantes contribuciones en el campo de la sociología, de los derechos humanos, de la filosofía, y también tocando áreas que tienen que ver con el arte, con la literatura y con el cine. Y es que todo su pensamiento está muy anclado en la idea de un cuerpo, ¿no es cierto?, que percibe desde los sentidos y que actúa desde la corporalidad. Así es que las formas estéticas a ella no le son indiferentes, le importan. Así que por ahí también uno se vincula, ¿no?, a su pensamiento. Judith Butler también ha realizado importantes contribuciones y sus textos han sido traducidos a más de 20 idiomas, ¿no? Ha tenido una estrecha relación con Latinoamérica, así que también es como una pensadora nuestra, nosotros la sentimos muy nuestra, ¿no? Yo creo que ella también se siente así. Se ha interesado mucho en los movimientos feministas latinoamericanos, también en las movilizaciones sociales que ha tenido el continente, de las cuales también ha participado y hablado en sus conferencias. El año pasado ella obtuvo el reconocimiento de doctora honoris causa por la Universidad de Chile. Yo creo que, bueno, sabemos que su pensamiento seduce a amplísimos sectores de la población en distintas partes del mundo y sobre todo a las mujeres y a las diversidades de género. Y yo creo que también es porque ella porta una energía emancipadora, ¿no? Que reivindica lo vital. Yo diría que ella siempre, de hecho, en este último libro, habla mucho de una vida vivible, ¿no? Se trata de una labor intelectual destinada a emancipar a los cuerpos y a las vidas de los distintos discursos de dominación que los oprimen y que les restan libertad, ¿no? Son precisamente esos discursos que a veces están naturalizados y instalados, los que ella se dedica a interrogar y a desmontar, pero no para destruirlo, sino para demostrar que no son naturales, ¿no? Ella siempre dice eso, esto no se trata de destruir las estructuras discursivas dominantes, sino que de desarmarlas, así como cuando los niños desarman un juguete, ¿no? Y ven de qué está hecho esto, para poder pensarlo. También, de alguna manera, ella, así como cuestiona estos discursos que son opresivos y que tienen, y que en el fondo con el fin de liberar a las personas de estar sometidas en su performatividad a estos discursos, ella también en sí misma es un objeto de agresión, ¿eh? Junto con su energía emancipadora, ella también ha sido percibida ella también representa como un grado de peligrosidad, ¿no?, para quienes desean mantener y preservar a toda costa estos discursos de control opresivo sobre el cuerpo. Ahí me estaba refiriendo por ejemplo, las agresiones que sufriste en Brasil, Judith, cuando fuiste. O sea, que tú misma, en tu cuerpo ya, opera como con una energía de peligrosidad o que resulta amenazante a estos discursos de dominación que insisten en oprimir al cuerpo y las vidas. Bueno, últimamente también sus textos se han dirigido a alertar, ¿no es cierto?, sobre nuevas formas de fascismo que están emergiendo y que se expanden en distintas partes del mundo, y también como las nuevas estructuras de agresión que están afectando a inmigrantes, a negros, a pobres, a las poblaciones trans, etc. Y bueno, justamente de eso se trata el último libro que publicó online, ¿no? Ese libro todavía no está en papel, porque la Judith no para de pensar. Y en este libro reúne una serie de artículos y de ensayos en donde explora los distintos modos colectivos y solidarios de resistencia a la violencia de hoy. Desde, por ejemplo, las manifestaciones, las asambleas, las campañas de denuncia, también pasando por otras formas expresivas, que eso me encantó de este libro, como el ruido molesto, la risa, el grito, el llanto por los caídos, dice, o sea, también como una forma de reivindicar el valor de todas las vidas por igual y de la llorabilidad de una vida, concepto muy bonito, el de la llorabilidad. Y también habla del ejercicio de la memoria como una forma de resistencia política, ¿no? Para que nunca más, se dice acá en Chile, para que nunca más. Es muy interesante cómo Butler valora la potencia discursiva de aquellas expresiones que se salen del discurso, ¿no? Como ese planteamiento me pareció muy interesante. Así es que de eso vamos a hablar ahora, de este libro que se llama Sin miedo, formas de resistencia a la violencia de hoy. Así que, welcome Judith. So it's a pleasure for us to hear to you and to talk about your last book.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here, although we are all, as it were, stuck in place. But it is always wonderful for me to be engaged with activists and intellectuals in Chile, and I'm just sorry I'm not there. I have very fond memories of being there and meeting so many quite astonishing people. And of course, in the last months before COVID made us all stop our lives in certain ways, I was extremely interested to see the assemblies and the demonstrations that were taking place throughout Chile, and the radical demand for democracy, the critique of revisionism, negationism, the centrality of feminism in its struggle against violence. These are all movements that I have been enormously moved by. I am, as you may imagine, alarmed by the fact that the US government is now engaging in fascist tactics, police forces, federal forces, arresting people, taking them away in vans, gassing people who are assembling peaceably. And it occurs to me that we are now practicing, this government, my government is practicing the very forms of suppression, harassment, violence that we exported to you, that we exported to Latin America through the Panama School, right? Now it comes back to us. I don't know how far it goes, but hopefully we push him from office very soon. Even if he does not agree to go, we push him from office, and we then can think about remaking our world. In fact, today I would like to talk a little bit about the desire to remake the world. I think that in March of this year, we, maybe mid-March and early April, we were, most of us, locked down, asked to shelter in place. This is the phrase in English. And there was an interesting phenomenon. Some people actually saw this as a sign of hope or a condition for hope. But the economy shut down, right? Capitalism's endless machine was not working. The environment was left to repair itself. And there were, I think, understandably, and still are hopes, well, maybe the capitalist machine does not have to start again in the same way. Maybe we could take down capitalism. Maybe now that we see the environment starting to flourish, the animals, the birds, the air, the water, I've never breathed such air. I was able to breathe in early April in a way that I had not breathed for a long time. I mean, yes, I have asthma, so it makes sense. But for people like me, it was new air. It was new air. So there was this hope. Arundhati Roy talked about this cessation of activity as a portal onto a different future. Um, Angela Davis said this is our occasion to rethink and remake our world, right? So there was an optimism, maybe even a utopianism, even though the COVID virus was taking lives and terrifying all of us, making many people ill. There was nevertheless a kind of optimism. At the same time, there was another problem, namely that the pandemic exacerbated forms of social inequality, economic inequality that were already there. Um, Especially in my country, but throughout the world, people who are Black or brown, those who are disabled, those whose health conditions are already compromised, became more vulnerable. And in countries such as my own, the access to healthcare is not guaranteed. This is the ultra capitalist approach to healthcare. If you have money, if you have a job, you can buy your health care, or your employer buys your health care. If you're poor, you can apply for some assistance, but it's not adequate, and you don't get the same care. And if you're Black or brown, sometimes you try to get care, there's discrimination, you get bad care or no care. So these social inequalities were exacerbated, intensified under the conditions of the pandemic. At the same time, we were having some utopian longings, visions, right? And there was this question, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Well, in my view, it is a struggle. There is no utopian future that unfolds automatically. There is no intensification of social inequality that happens by itself. It depends on human practices, and it depends on our ability to intervene in the political and economic world, which is why, in some ways, more people are politically engaged, at least in this country, than previously was the case. The surprising form of optimism, which I also to some degree shared, and I'll talk about that, seemed to be based on the following reasoning. If the world was shutting down, capitalism was shutting down. If the world was shutting down, then all of its radical inequalities were shutting down. There was something about seeing the economic and social machinery grinding to a halt that gave rise to the hope that we were being given a chance to remake the world. And yet, in the last 2.5 months, I would say, there has been a reopening of the world, which was understood as, implemented as, the restarting of the economy. So it is as if the world could not or should not be anything other than the economy in its present form. Maybe we were wrong to think that the workings of capitalism could suddenly come to a halt, and that we could work together to produce a better world. Maybe we were wrong to think that the pandemic could actually function as a way of reflecting our equality and our interdependence. Well, I don't think we were exactly wrong, but we were not prepared for this struggle, at least some of us. One problem is that the concept of the world, or the aspiration to remake the world, imagined it as a tabula rasa, a new beginning, without asking whether the new brings with it a weighty history, whether new beginnings are really breaks with the past, or can be. Another problem clearly deeper and persistent, is that the economy, by which I mean the market economy that belongs to capitalism, very quickly came to replace the imagined world in the mainstream public discourse. The health of the economy was understood to be more valuable and more urgent than the health of the people. Indeed, attributing health to the economy figures the economy as a human body, an organism, one whose life and growth must be supported at all costs. But the transposition of health onto the economy, the attribution of health to the economy, didn't just transfer a human attribute to the economy, it actually drained health from living bodies precisely to establish the healthy economy. At least that's how I think the organic figure of the economy works. I want to suggest that this notion of the health of the economy comes at the expense of the health of those who are workers, minorities, the poor, those with already compromised health. The economic health, the health of the economy doesn't merely borrow the life of those bodies as it represents the economy as healthy or unhealthy. It actually sacrifices the health of those bodies. So the false consolation of the cost-benefit model is that it allows for the health and life of the body to be replaced by a number, a percentage, and a graphic curve. The latter is not a simple representation of the living body, but in our present times, at least, it becomes the means of its effacement. The graphic sign and number is meant to show how many or how few have died. And if the curve is flattening, we are supposed to rejoice because only so many people are dying now. That is taken to be good news, right? We become happy when the curve is flatter, but we do not realize that the curve is still communicating death. It's like, oh, only so many have died. I can live with that. In a way, that what the curve does is it communicates to us that we must be prepared to accept a certain level of death, and that government is communicating to us the acceptable level of death. So I just want to be clear that this is a kind of calculation. We can reopen the market, even though it respikes the virus, and even though it imperils the lives and it is supposed to be defending. The point of the curve in the serving of market rationality is to establish the level of illness and death that we are supposed to accept as reasonable, the right number of deaths, the right extension of the horizontal line, the one that establishes the number of deaths we are willing to live with, right? So that line represents dying bodies, but of course that line does not graphically give us anything of the life of those bodies, who is dying, where they are, what communities they belong to, nothing. So the representational form, I would suggest, sanitizes those deaths. It exemplifies in a remarkably vivid form the death drive at the heart of capitalism. Okay, so if the world that we were imagining, the world that we would remake, was the remaking of the world was replaced by the restarting of the economy, and the economy was understood as undergoing a health crisis, then it became our responsibility to go back to work, to reopen the economy for business, to flood the churches and the gyms and the beaches if we live near them. You and I live close enough, even though that clearly meant that the virus would spread and more people would lose their health, even lose their lives. Unspoken here, presupposed here, is the dispensability of all those lives who are thinking, I'm embracing freedom. I'm embracing freedom, even as they head towards illness and death, their own or others they know or may not know. At the same time, what we are told about safety protocols imagines that we're living in a certain kind of domestic environment. The safety protocols are not possible for everyone. What does it mean to shelter in place if that place is densely populated, or if you're living in a house which is filled with domestic violence, or when there is no stable shelter, or if one is in prison and there is no way to take distance from other people? The older Marxist formulation about industrial labor without health protections takes new form within the pandemic. One must work in order to secure a wage, in order to live, and yet, by working under unprotected conditions, one increases the probability of one's own illness and death and the illness and death of others. That may sound dire, but frankly, the situation is dire, since now it has become clear, at least where I live, and where many people live, that the state-directed imperative to open the economy comes at the cost of human lives, and those lives are generally the lives of those working in service economies, the lives of those who have continuously, through history, been deprived of adequate health care, and that includes a wide range of people of color. Here are some examples you may not know. Well, in Brazil, in São Paulo, people of color are 62% more likely to die from COVID-19 than their white counterparts. Higher mortality rates have been reported in Seine-Saint-Denis arrondissement in France, where many migrants from North Africa live. In the US, the COVID-19 death rate for African Americans is more than double that of other racial groups, and Latinx constitute 34% of cases nationwide, even as they constitute only 18% of the population. In California, Latinx represent more than 50% of the cases, and the death rates are increasing daily and disproportionately. The situation is mirrored in England and Wales, where the death rate for Black, Pakistani, Bangladeshi people is nearly double that of white people, even when class and some health factors are taken into account. Statistics like these are important. So is the curve. It's not like I'm against graphs of all kinds. I need those graphs. I learn from those graphs. But they cannot explain why something is happening, and they cannot explain the social and phenomenological implications of the illness. To do that, we have to consider slow forms of killing, which is, I would suggest, part of what we mean by structural racism and sanitized death. Of course, violence includes overt forms of police violence, as well as the structural features of what we can call a carceral economy: physical coercion, battery, debasement, rape, murder. This has been the central focus of the anti-racism movement that has swept across the United States and many other regions of the world. But there's another focus there as well, one that is especially acute under the conditions of pandemic. This might be understood as a slower form of violence, one whose pace and mechanism becomes nearly identical with the rhythms of ordinary life, or at least with the accepted rationale for work under conditions that guarantee the loss of life or the likelihood of illness. Most people don't imagine that they are regarding other lives as dispensable, leaving them to die by accepting a rationale of this kind. They do not recognize the form that this complicity takes. For letting another die is not a sovereign decision. A sovereign decides who should live, who should die. And yet, in some sense, there is a decision taking place, whether through a fugitive form of sovereignty or by virtue of a biopolitics that turns out to be a necropolitics as it unfolds. Similarly, the manic celebrations of personal liberty after the lockdown involve forms of consumer behavior that involve, for instance, large crowds drinking without masks, a great deal of homosocial body against body excitement, not homosexual, homosocial, right-wing gatherings that defy public health warnings, Bolsonaro on his motorcycle, whatever. These kinds of displays are meant to communicate that these subjects are not vulnerable, they do not fear death, and they don't care if they are spreading the virus to others, right? It's an ultimate deformation of personal liberty. They associate their liberty with the right to do harm to others or to themselves. Although a personal liberty and belonging to the individual, its paradigmatic expression in the US right now is mindless sociability, right? I'm resisting the government by breaking these protocols. And I love Trump, in their view, precisely because he also resists the government and breaks his own protocols. It's a beautiful, terrible situation. Too few consider that they are indirectly producing conditions in which others are more likely to fall ill and die. They're not shooting anyone. It's not a sovereign exercise of violence, but they're engaging in practices that facilitate the illness and death of other. Their denial and their manic assertion of personal liberty, unconstrained by governmental regulations, leads to a form of enthusiastic and self-righteous necropolitics. How do we understand letting die as a permutation of violence? Now, of course, the question of who should live and who should die is an age-old one, and it is usually posed by those who do not consider themselves a possible factor in the equation, right? People who are calculating what is the acceptable level of death do not imagine that they will be one of those who die. In fact, as someone who calculates, they imagine themselves in the position of social engineer. They are exempt from the problem of life and death. They're thinking about it. It's an object for them, but they are never one of those living creatures about whom the calculation is made. The others are those whose life and death can be calculated, but calculation saves the calculator from death, at least in fantasy. This post-sovereign or neo-sovereign form of calculation gives rise to a form of inequality that relies upon a metric of grievability. Whose life, if lost, would count as a loss, even constitute an incalculable loss? Indeed, all of our lives should be regarded as incalculably valuable, and if we were to die, our death should be an incalculable loss. In other words, life and death should not be subject to calculations of this kind. And yet, whose death can be quietly calculated without ever naming it as such? Here is where social inequality works together with necropolitical violence. It would have laid out a clear path to resistance had the pandemic only etched firmly the contours of inequality within our institutions, households, and public spheres, exacerbating for many the lived sense of peril associated with the workplace, the home, and the street. It would have marked out another path of political mobilization had the pandemic simply and clearly underscored the necessity of climate justice and rallied people across the globe to join in that impressive and urgent movement. Similarly, the communities of care that have emerged in the midst of this pandemic have constituted new social forms, life-giving, expanding the notion of shelter beyond the household, right? Finding ways to escape from the household as the primary unit, precisely through community ties that distribute the responsibility for food, for shelter, for medicine, for transport. Indeed, the task for us now is to expand the notion of shelter beyond the household and the nation. And the same could be said about the public art, now online, that has us listening and watching in new ways. But the police violence against Black people, women and men, trans people, travesti, and the indigenous in places like Brazil, the poor in India, coincides with the systematic forms of letting die promoted and accepted by the market enthusiasts. So the problem is not just rectifying social inequality, and it's not just fighting the destruction of the climate, although it is both and must be both. It is also fighting the forms of violence that take sovereign, direct form, and neo-sovereign or necro-political form, letting die. And it is the market rationality which is primarily responsible for that letting die, which is why I call it the death drive in the midst of the capitalist machine. The murder of George Floyd and a long and lengthening list of women and men who belong to communities of color in the United States has shifted and intensified an already pervasive sense of peril, not only because he was yet another Black life extinguished by brutal police force, but because the spectacle of his killing was a shameless advertisement for white supremacy, a resurgence of the practice of lynching explicitly performed for the cell phone video. That policeman was not hiding, he was showing. And it is still, once again, 200, 300 years of this practice. It is still the neck, and it is once again the chokehold. The collective trauma for Black people cannot be underestimated in its intergenerational and present form, especially now when so many Black lives are claimed by COVID-19 because healthcare has been, as I suggested, inadequate, inaccessible, or unaffordable. The disproportionate number of deaths in communities of color more generally speaks to a systemic racism within a brutal and broken healthcare system. The very same community that is mourning the loss of lives that could have and should have been treated and saved suffers at the same time brutalization by police on the street. You may remember that Foucault thought there was a difference between taking another's life and letting another die. We see that police violence that takes life works in tandem with health systems that let die. So when we talk about systemic racism, we are actually talking about the link between those two forms of violence. I would not call them competing crises or dueling disasters. The systemic racism we find in the healthcare system is linked to the police violence that is directed disproportionately against people of color. So, am I debunking the idea of a new beginning? No, not exactly. But if we thought people might gather and decide in what form the world should be renewed, we perhaps underestimated the pull, the force, the power of the market, its monopolization of the very idea of world, its monopolization of the very idea of health. And to renew and to repair the world, it will be necessary to understand that the extreme form of social inequality is to be found in the explicit and insidious power over life and death. We had and still have reason to believe that this death-driven economy can be opposed. Not only the myriad social movements that are seeking to stop and reverse the destruction of the planet, to end the last forms of colonialism in Palestine, to oppose every form of sexual and racial violence and indignity, but the virus too plays a role. Even as social structures of inequality are heightened under pandemic conditions, the pandemic exposes a global vulnerability. There is no one who has been completely immune, even as we know there are a wide range of immunological responses, ranging from asymptomatic to fatal. But to the extent that everyone is or has been vulnerable to the virus, it follows that follows from the vulnerability of the human body to viral infection. The body responds to what it takes in. Breathing is fundamental to life, and yet under pandemic conditions, breathing in, breathing out produces a potential for harm, even death. It is no accident that as coronavirus produces acute respiratory distress, threatening those afflicted with asphyxiation, suffocation, the police in Minneapolis dig their knee into the neck of George Floyd to arrest his breathing and finish off his life. The virus happens to all of us. It affects all of us, potentially or actually. And some of us more grievously than others, especially to those with no access to ventilators or health care, or who, over time, as a result of poor care, discrimination, and exclusion, never had the medical care that they deserved. Under these conditions, at once viral and social, the conditions of living carry the risks of dying. The vector of breathing in, breathing out tells us something about a fundamental dependency on air that climate justice activists have been teaching for some time. But it also asks us to rethink the usual terms through which we understand vulnerability, as well as doing harm and doing violence. Vulnerability is usually understood, well, as the condition of being potentially harmed by another. But vulnerability also names the porous and interdependent character of our bodily lives and social selves. We are given over from the start to a world of others we never chose in order to emerge as more or less singular beings. I say more or less because that dependency, however mediated, does not precisely end with adulthood. It is coextensive with life. From the beginning, an infant survives by taking something in, whether nourishment, touch, or air. Something from the outside makes a singular life possible. That from the outside is taken in. We are impressed upon by the environment, social world, intimate contact, and it is being impressed upon by that which supports and nourishes us, that we become alive, that we are sustained as living creatures. That impressionability and porosity define our embodied social lives. We are not just these contained individuals totally wrapped in our individuality, no. This is one reason why the radical individualism celebrated by groups mindlessly crowding each other exhibits the inevitably social character of that doctrine of individualism that correlates with the market economy. We need perhaps to revisit philosophers like Merleau-Ponty to tell us what it means to us when another breathes out and I breathe in, that something of my breath can and does find its way into another person, that we live in a world where we are always in this kind of contact, where we depend upon each other, and that interdependency is part of the world in which we live, which is why it must be safeguarded in its safest possible forms. The human trace that someone leaves on an object may well be what I touch, what I pass along on another surface, what I absorb into my own body. Humans share the air with one another and with animals. They share the surfaces of the world. They speak to one another in loud voices and with abandon. They sing together. I mean, singing together is the sign of a good day. And yet, these reciprocal and intertwining modes of world sharing and world making describe a crucial dimension of our vulnerability, but also an interdependence characteristic of what it means to be embodied in a social world. The unwilled and unknowing aspect of this interdependence, brought out most clearly by the virus that operates without our consent and against our will. The virus can remind us that there is no escape from interdependence, even as safe shelter is sought, and practices are honed. The shelter and the practice acknowledge that interdependency. But those who refuse the mask, the shelter, the practices, attack the very notion that our bodies are irreversibly implicated in one another, and that life itself depends upon the regulation of that interdependency, the social organization of that interdependency according to principles of livability, equality, and social freedom, a freedom that does not come at the expense of others. I would suggest that insofar as interdependency is understood in this way, the critique of individualism makes more sense, as does a notion of social equality that relies on a politics of non-violence. Vulnerability is not the basis of such a politics, but it may well be a portal through which to understand social interdependency in a new way, even perhaps in a utopian way. Presently, that interdependency is registered through the grid of social inequality. One group is established as more vulnerable than another group, but perhaps as well, it describes a condition of life necessarily shared, the perils and passions of bodily exposure to another, of porosity, taking or letting something in, letting something out, existing as it were in that threshold and through such passages. When social inequality implies a greater likelihood of dying, then the portal to the future is a more radical and substantive social equality, a more mindful form of collective freedom, and a mass mobilization against violence, gender violence, sexual violence, racial violence, violence against indigenous peoples, both in its explicit and its fugitive forms. If we seek to repair the world, and I think we should, or indeed the planet, then the world must be unshackled from the market economy that traffics and profits from its distribution of life and death. A politics of life would not be the reactionary one, nor would it be a simple vitalism. Rather, it would be a reflection on the shared conditions of life for the purposes of realizing a more radical equality and honoring a non-violent ethical and political mandate. Perhaps this is a way to begin again the world, even as that world is already underway, to repair forward, as it were, as a new imaginary emerges from the hauntings of the present. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Judith.
Gracias.
Muy interesante tu reflexión, anclada en este momento, ¿no? Tan raro, tan de suspensión en el que estamos. Intentaba vincular tu discurso a este libro, ¿no? Que es como la novedad. Cómo la violencia sanitaria reproduce estas estructuras sistémicas de desigualdad, donde unas vidas valen más que otras.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Y volviendo un poco a tu figura, Judith, como para buscar una esperanza también. Tú como una filósofa que pone el cuerpo, que actúa en el mundo, y que hablas esto del discurso valiente, ¿no? Quizás este discurso valiente, que no es que sea valiente porque tenga una persona virtuosa, que tenga gran coraje, ¿no? Sino que supera el miedo para poder resistir de forma colectiva y solidaria. ¿Cómo ves eso ahora? ¿Cómo en esta situación, cómo se podrían activar un discurso valiente, colectivo y solidario?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. There are at least three questions in your question, as I understood it. No, perfect, excellent questions. But first of all, let me say, well, let's start with the concept of communities of care, or communities of social solidarity that have emerged under the pandemic. In many ways, the pandemic has forced people back into households, which produces any number of problems. Women who suffer from battery or marital rape, or children, especially queer and trans youth, who are stuck in households, losing a sense of their broader community. It would seem that this domestication that has gone along with the pandemic has evacuated the streets or undercut the possibility of broader alliances. But I think that is not true. Many of our alliances have become virtual. There's been an intensification of trans-regional conversation like this one. There are still street actions, but they're street actions that exemplify forms of self-care and care for the other. So one issue that we, for instance, in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations here in the US, we saw no spike in the virus afterwards. Why? Everyone masked, everyone careful. People were taking care of each other. They were taking care of themselves. They were They were living in community together. They understood that their bodies could be harmed and could harm, right? They were connected to other people in their ethics. They weren't just looking out for themselves, they were looking out for others at the same time. And this shows us the link between self and other that is so crucial to undoing the effects of egoistic individualism and building a sense of social solidarity. Now, social solidarity can be a problem if it just belongs to this community and not to others, right? Or if it's just this region. It actually has to be global. It has to be a global solidarity. And we see this because the virus is global, right? What happens in China, what happens in Italy also happens here. We are linked to one another through travel and through exchange of various kinds. But what I want to say is that this has been a time for reflection, for reading, for going online to listen to each other, for new forms of mobilization that involve internet activity, including deplatforming and fighting with Facebook, and producing enormous pressures on governments to have transparent and accountable health policy, to develop a guaranteed national income in hyper-capitalist societies, to establish healthcare as a social right, to get protection and shelter and alternate community for women who are experiencing violence at home. These kinds of networks are still there, and they are crossing households. They are producing a different sense of shelter and a different sense of community, not just family and household. Those connections allow for a decentering of the heteronormative family and a continuing elaboration of forms of community. Now, we may want assemblies on the street, and we will have them, but we can have online assemblies, and we can have hybrid models. We meet on the street carefully, we meet online carefully. We move between the virtual and the corporeal. That is how our lives function anyway, for the most part. And these are still strong alliances. I would say in the past 3 months, I have seen stronger alliances between parts of the world that were not in communication before. I've been I've been connected with, and not just me as a public intellectual, but I see connections between Moscow and Italy. I see connections between Korea and India. I see enormous forms of alliance, and which also involve translation, both as a technique. I thank the translator here, by the way, but also translation as a practice of life. Not everybody comes into English. We go out. We are all in different languages, and we're struggling to understand the frameworks within which we live. So I see that alliance is taking different forms, and I'm very interested in the idea of communities of care and forms of social solidarity under the pandemic, insofar as they exemplify radical equality, anti-violence, a politics of life for the left, right? The right wing has for so long said we are pro-life, pro-life. No, we need a politics of life for the left, which means a livable world for everyone, a livable world that involves social equality and that does not discriminate against women as the politics of life does for the right. So, the politics of life for the right is a way of saying women's lives don't matter. So we don't want that. We want women's lives to matter in every sense of that term. I also think it's not that we're individuals who enter into community and then we go back to being individuals. We are in community all the time, even when there are no others around. In other words, the social structure of our lives is such that my health depends on a healthcare system. My ability to breathe depends on affordable medicine. Those are social and economic worlds that are making those medicines, building those institutions. And if those institutions fail me or I can't afford those medicines, I'm not living. This body does not live. This body depends on the infrastructural conditions of life, as does every other body. We share that dependency, which is why we need to take responsibility for the conditions of livability and to remake the world in such a way that radical equality and social freedom and ultimately the question of justice become exemplified in our local practices as well as our global institutions.
Gracias, Judith. El tiempo es muy breve y ya estamos terminando. Me hubiera encantado haberte hecho muchas más preguntas. Hay tanto que repensar, ¿no? Reformular el cuerpo, reformular la idea de la interdependencia, interrogar, ¿no es cierto?, el sistema desigual. Me imagino que tú estás con mucho trabajo pensando.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but your questions are persistent ones. They're ones I will be thinking about for a long time, and I hope we have another chance to be in conversation.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, con esto cerramos esta sesión de Puerto de Ideas con esta pensadora magnífica que esperamos poder volver a tenerla en otro momento para que nos vaya contando las nuevas cosas que sigue pensando sin parar. Buenas tardes.